The rain fell not as a cleansing shower, but as a relentless assault, a cold, hard curtain of water that blurred the world into a maelstrom of sound and sensation. For Alara, the world was always a tapestry woven from such things. The roar of the storm was a physical pressure against her eardrums. The icy drops were needles against her skin, and the slick, uneven pavement beneath her worn slippers was a treacherous landscape. Sightless, she had learned to navigate by the familiar echoes of her small world. But tonight that world had been ripped away. The front door had slammed shut with a definitive crack that sounded like a bone breaking. It was the last sound she had heard from inside the only home she knew, followed by the metallic click of the deadbolt. A final, absolute sound of rejection. "And don't you dare come back," Marcus's voice, thick with cheap whiskey and malice, had sliced through the storm's fury. "That money was wasted on a lost cause like you anyway. A real man has debts to pay." The money. Her life savings, painstakingly gathered from years of weaving intricate tapestries she sold at the local market, supplemented by the last of the inheritance her mother had left. It was the sum total of her hope, the price of a surgery that promised not a perfect world, but a world of light and shadow, of shapes and colors. A world where she might see the sun instead of just feeling its warmth. Marcus had taken it all. Now she stood shivering on the broken concrete of the front step, the thin cotton of her dress plastered to her body, offering no protection against the biting wind. The familiar scent of damp earth in her small herb garden was lost, overwhelmed by the city's stench of wet asphalt and decay. She took a tentative step, her bare arms crossed over her chest in a futile attempt to preserve some warmth. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. He had never gone this far before. The verbal abuse, the neglect, the casual cruelty, those had become the grim background music of her life. But this was different. This was an excommunication. She had nowhere to go. Her mother, her only protector, was a ghost in her memory, and the few friends she had made were casual market acquaintances, not people one could turn to in the dead of a stormy night. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She needed to move to find shelter, but every direction felt like a leap into an abyss. The sounds of the city were distorted by the rain, familiar traffic hisses becoming the roars of unseen beasts. Her foot slipped on a loose paving stone, and she gasped, her hands flying out to catch her balance. She stumbled forward off the curb and onto the street itself. The asphalt was a river of cold, gritty water that soaked through her slippers instantly. A car horn blared from somewhere to her left, a furious, impatient sound that made her flinch violently. She was exposed a fragile island in a torrent of noise and danger. Tears mixed with the rain on her face, hot and then instantly cold. She tried to orient herself to remember the layout of the street. The bakery was 2 blocks down. Maybe they would let her stay in the warm, dry entryway until morning. Clinging to that sliver of a plan, she began to walk, her body trembling uncontrollably, her every sense screaming with overload. The thunder overhead was not a distant rumble, but a concussive blast that seemed to shake the very ground she walked on. Each footstep was a guess, a prayer against a fall. She had no idea how far she had gone when a new sound cut through the chaos. It was closer, a low, powerful hum that grew rapidly into a menacing growl. The sound of an expensive engine slicing through the waterlogged street with effortless force. It was moving too fast. The sound was wrong, too close. She froze her head, turning toward the noise, her body tensing for an impact she could feel in the vibrations traveling through her feet. Damian Blackwood hated rainy nights in the city. They were inefficient. They slowed traffic, dirtied his car, and made the already grimy streets look even more pathetic. He gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel of his Bentley, his jaw tight with the residual frustration of a board meeting that had run 3 hours too long. All he wanted was the sterile silence of his penthouse, a glass of scotch, and a reprieve from the endless demands of his world. The city lights smeared across his windshield, a garish watercolor painting of reds and golds that did nothing to illuminate the road. His high-performance headlights cut a sharp white path through the downpour, revealing a street that was utterly deserted. Good. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, eager to put the dreary industrial district behind him. He was thinking about a hostile takeover bid, his mind sorting through figures and projections, when a shape materialized in the beams of his headlights. It was a flicker of movement, a pale, indistinct form, where there should have been nothing but rain and darkness. His reflexes, honed by years of discipline and control, took over. He slammed on the brakes. The massive car, a marvel of German engineering, responded instantly. Anti-lock brakes pulsed. Tires screamed in protest on the slick asphalt, and the vehicle lurched to a halt with a jolt that threw him forward against the lock of his seatbelt. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own harsh breathing, the frantic beat of the windshield wipers, and the drumming of the rain on the roof. In the stark white glare of his lights, not 10 feet from his front bumper, stood a woman, or rather a girl. She looked impossibly young, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face and neck. She was wearing a flimsy dress that was no match for the weather, and she was standing perfectly still, her face turned toward his car, her posture a brittle study in terror. Damien's first reaction was a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. A reckless pedestrian, a potential insurance scam. Another complication in a day already filled with them. He was about to lean on the horn to unleash the fury coiling in his gut. But something stopped him. It was her eyes. They were wide, unfocused, and staring not at him, but through him, as if looking at something far beyond the car and the rain. There was a milky, clouded quality to them that sent an unexpected and unwelcome chill down his spine. She was blind. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a certainty. The anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, pragmatic assessment of the situation. He could not just drive away. Leaving an obviously vulnerable blind woman in the middle of the street during a storm was not just callous, it was a potential liability. His corporation had a meticulously crafted public image to maintain. With a curse under his breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed the black umbrella from the passenger seat, and pushed open the heavy door. The storm immediately invaded the calm, climate-controlled sanctuary of his car. The wind tore at him, and the rain was cold as it spattered his custom-tailored suit. He strode toward her, his expensive Italian shoes splashing through puddles. As he got closer, he could see she was trembling violently, her lips tinged with blue. She was a slip of a thing, looking as if a strong gust of wind could carry her away. "Are you insane?" he asked, his voice sharper and colder than he intended. Standing in the middle of the road like this, Alara flinched as if he had struck her. The voice was deep, resonant, and laced with an impatient authority that immediately set her on edge. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. She could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and damp wool. He was close. Too close. I'm sorry, she stammered, her own voice barely a whisper against the storm. "I was lost. I didn't hear you." Damien held the large umbrella over her, creating a small, temporary pocket of shelter. The rain stopped hammering down on her head, a sudden, startling reprieve. He looked down at her, taking in the pale, delicate features, the dark smudges of exhaustion under her eyes. There was something about her face, a faint, nagging echo in the back of his mind. Had he seen her before? The thought was absurd. Their worlds could not be more different. "Lost isn't an excuse for a death wish," he said, his tone clipped. "Where are you going?" She swallowed hard, the simple question feeling like an insurmountable obstacle. I don't know." The admission was humiliating, a stark confession of her utter helplessness. Damien's patience, always a finite resource, was wearing thin. He had a problem on his hands, and he needed to solve it efficiently. "You don't have a phone. Anyone you can call?" She shook her head, a small, miserable gesture. "No, I don't have anything." He let out a sigh of exasperation. This was getting worse by the second. He glanced up and down the desolate street. There were no open businesses, no signs of life. Leaving her here was not an option. A grim sense of inevitability settled over him. "Get in the car," he commanded, not offering a choice. Ilara recoiled, taking a clumsy step back. "No, I can't. Who are you?" Fear, raw and primal, coursed through her. Getting into a stranger's car was the one rule that had been drilled into her since childhood. A man with a voice like that, a car that hummed with quiet power, he was dangerous. Damien's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being refused. "My name is Damien Blackwood, and right now I am the only person offering you a way out of this storm. You can either get in my car and go to a hospital, or you can stay here and risk pneumonia or worse. Your choice." He presented it as a choice, but his tone made it clear there was only one logical answer. The hospital. The word resonated with a bitter irony. Just this morning, the hospital had represented hope, a future. Now it was a place for patching up the damage of her present. But it was also shelter. It was warmth. It was safety. Her resistance crumbled under the weight of her desperation. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Without another word, Damien took her arm. His grip was firm, impersonal, guiding her around the front of the car. Her skin was freezing to the touch. He opened the passenger door and gently but firmly steered her inside. The interior of the car was an oasis of warmth and silence. It smelled of rich leather and something clean and masculine. The soft upholstery felt impossibly luxurious against her damp, cold skin. She sat rigidly as he closed the door, shutting out the storm. He walked around the car and slid back into the driver's seat, bringing a gust of wind and a spray of rain with him. The silence that fell between them was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated mistrust. Alara listened to the soft clicks and whirs as he adjusted the climate controls. A wave of warm air washed over her, making her shiver even more violently as the feeling began to return to her frozen limbs. She hugged herself, acutely aware of the puddle forming around her on the plush floor mat. She was soiling this pristine, expensive space. Damien drove without speaking, his focus entirely on the road. His mind, however, was racing. He kept glancing at the girl beside him. She was a mess of contradictions, fragile and yet possessed of a quiet stillness. Frightened, but not hysterical. Who was she? What series of unfortunate events had led her to be cast out into a storm like this? He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, not mysteries. And this girl was a mystery that had landed quite literally in his path. They pulled up to the brightly lit covered entrance of St. Jude's General Hospital's emergency wing. The automatic doors slid open, spilling a wave of sterile, antiseptic-scented air. Damien put the car in park and turned to her. "We're here." Alara didn't move. She was overwhelmed. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant beep of machines, the murmur of hushed voices, it was a sensory assault. "I'll have a nurse come out for you," Damien said, his voice flat, businesslike. He was already reaching for his phone, ready to delegate this problem, to hand her off to professionals and remove himself from the situation. "Wait," she said, her voice small. She turned her head in his direction, her sightless eyes seeming to search his face. "Thank you." The two simple words were spoken with a sincerity that caught him off guard. In his world, gratitude was a currency often offered but rarely genuine. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time since she had gotten into the car. He saw the vulnerability, the fear, but underneath it, he saw a flicker of something else. A core of strength that had not yet been extinguished. And again, that unsettling feeling of familiarity, like a word on the tip of his tongue, a forgotten melody. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, an anomaly brought on by a long, stressful day. "Don't thank me yet," he replied coolly, his mask of indifference firmly back in place. "You're just a problem I needed to solve." He made the call, his words clipped and efficient. Within moments, two nurses appeared with a wheelchair. He watched as they helped the silent, dripping girl from his car, as they wrapped her in a warm blanket and wheeled her through the sliding doors, disappearing into the clinical brightness of the hospital. As he drove away, the empty passenger seat felt strangely cold. He told himself it was just the lingering dampness. But as the rain-slicked streets of the city sped by, he could not shake the image of her face or the unnerving feeling that their paths had not crossed by accident. The emergency room was a world of controlled chaos, a symphony of beeping machines, hushed but urgent voices, and the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic that failed to mask the underlying scent of fear. Alara was guided through it all in a blur of sensations. The gentle but firm hands of a nurse steered her wheelchair, the woman's voice a calm and reassuring murmur amidst the noise. She was taken to a small private cubicle where the cold, wet dress was peeled away and replaced with a warm, soft hospital gown. A doctor with a quiet voice and gentle hands examined her, checking her for hypothermia. Asking questions, she answered in a near monotone. Every touch, every sound was amplified in her sightless world. She felt like a stray animal brought in from the wild, scrubbed clean, and catalogued her fate resting in the hands of strangers. The most prominent stranger, the man from the car, was a formidable presence she could feel even in his absence. Damien Blackwood. The name was unfamiliar, but the power it conveyed was not. It had been in the low timbre of his voice, the expensive scent of his clothes, the effortless way he had commanded the world around him. He had called her a problem he needed to solve. What did that mean? Once she was warmed and fed, would he cast her back out into the storm? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the cold. She was eventually moved to a quiet room on a different floor. It was warm and blessedly silent, save for the soft hum of a machine by her bed. A nurse brought her a tray with a bowl of hot soup and a cup of tea. The simple meal was the most comforting thing she had experienced in years. As the warmth spread through her, the adrenaline that had kept her going for hours began to drain away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. She lay back against the crisp pillows, her body aching, her mind a turbulent sea of uncertainty. She was safe for now. But for how long, and what price would this safety demand? In a secluded, elegantly furnished waiting lounge reserved for hospital benefactors, Damian Blackwood paced the floor. The plush Persian rug did nothing to soften the hard, restless energy that radiated from him. He had shed his rain-dampened suit jacket, and his tie was loosened, the only signs of disarray in his otherwise immaculate appearance. His phone was pressed to his ear. "I want to know everything, Alex," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Her name is Ilara. That's all she said. Check police records, missing persons hospital admissions for the last 48 hours. I want to know where she came from, why she was on that street, and who she is. I don't like anomalies. I don't." On the other end of the line, his executive assistant Alex, a man renowned for his supernatural efficiency, simply said, "On it, sir. I'll have something for you within the hour." Damian ended the call and stared out the panoramic window at the rain-lashed city below. The lights of the metropolis glittered like a carpet of scattered jewels, a kingdom he commanded. He was a man who thrived on information, on control. This girl Ilara was an unknown variable, a disruption to the orderly progression of his life. His instincts, the ones that had made him a titan in the cutthroat world of finance, were screaming that something was amiss. People like her didn't just appear out of thin air. There was always an angle, a motive. Perhaps this was an elaborate scheme by a business rival, a twisted form of corporate espionage designed to get close to him. Yet as his mind worked through the cynical possibilities, the image of her face kept intruding. The stark vulnerability, the strange, unfocused beauty of her eyes, and that inexplicable feeling of familiarity. It irritated him, this crack in his logical facade. It was a loose thread, and he had every intention of pulling it until the entire story unraveled. Less than an hour later, his phone buzzed. Alex's report. "Sir, I have the information you requested." Alex's voice was crisp. "Her full name is Ilara Vance, age 19, no criminal record. Her mother, Liana Vance, passed away 3 years ago. She lives or lived at an address in the industrial sector with her stepfather, a man named Marcus Thorne." Damian repeated the name. "What about him?" "He has a record, sir. Mostly gambling debts, a few minor fraud charges. He's well known to local loan sharks. More importantly, I cross-referenced Ms. Vance with medical archives. She was scheduled for a preliminary consultation for corneal transplant surgery next week at this very hospital. The procedure was being funded by a private account in her name, an account that was completely emptied via an ATM withdrawal early this evening. The ATM is located 2 blocks from a bar Marcus Thorne frequents." Damian's knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. The story was becoming clearer, and it was ugly. A gambling addict stepfather stealing a blind girl's surgery money and throwing her out into a storm. It was the kind of sordid, pathetic tragedy he usually only read about in tabloids. It elicited a flicker of something cold and sharp within him, not pity, but a distaste for the sheer predatory weakness of men like Marcus Thorne. "Is that all?" Damian asked. There was a brief pause on the other end. "No, sir. There's something else. Something you need to know. As per your standing instructions, I run all new names through the Blackwood Corporation's internal security files." Her name, Ilara Vance, was flagged. Damian stood straighter. "Flagged for what?" "It matches the witness report from your grandmother's accident 2 months ago." Alex said, his professional tone unable to completely mask the gravity of his words. "The hit and run. Ms. Vance was the unidentified Samaritan. She was the one who pushed Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood out of the path of the speeding car." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air in the room grew thin. The accident. His grandmother, his formidable, unshakable grandmother, had been left bruised and terrified by a car that had mounted the sidewalk in broad daylight. The driver had never been found. The police had one witness, a woman who had acted instantly, saving Eleanor's life at her own risk. The report states the witness suffered a severe blow to the head when she fell. Alex continued, his voice echoing in Damien's stunned silence. She declined medical transport at the scene, saying she was fine. But a follow-up note from the investigating officer speculates that the impact may have exacerbated a pre-existing medical condition. Sir, the timeline of her total vision loss corresponds with that head injury. The puzzle pieces didn't just fall into place, they slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The familiarity, the vague echo in his memory. It was her, the woman who had saved the most important person in his life, the woman who had traded her own sight for his grandmother's safety. And he had called her a problem. Without another word, Damien ended the call and strode out of the room, his long legs eating up the corridor. He bypassed the elevators, taking the private stairwell to the penthouse floor, the VIP wing where his grandmother was still recovering from a hairline fracture she'd sustained in the fall. He found Eleanor Blackwood sitting up in her luxurious hospital suite, a silk robe over her shoulders, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She was looking at a tablet, but her sharp blue eyes, the same eyes Damien had inherited, snapped up the moment he entered. "I was wondering when you'd come to see me," she said, her voice retaining its customary steel. "The nurses have been buzzing all night. My grandson, the corporate raider, playing the role of a knight in shining armor, rescuing a damsel in distress from the storm." Damien ignored the jibe. "You know, it wasn't a question. I know that the brave young woman who saved my life is in this very hospital, brought here by you," Eleanor said, her gaze intense. "A coincidence of such magnitude feels more like the hand of fate, wouldn't you agree? Her name is Alara Vance." He stood at the foot of her bed, a giant of a man, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy before his headmistress. "I just found out. A debt of life is not something to be taken lightly, Damien." She continued, her voice softening slightly. "It is the heaviest debt of all. A check, a donation. Those are insults. This girl lost the very light from her world to keep me in mine. You cannot repay that, but you can honor it. You will see to it that she is cared for. You will give her back the future she lost for my sake. Is that understood?" Her words were a command wrapped in the guise of maternal wisdom. For Eleanor Blackwood, honor was not a concept, it was a mandate. And for Damien, his grandmother's word was law. He left her suite a few minutes later, his mind a whirlwind. Duty, honor, debt. These were the principles his family was built on. He had a debt to pay, a monumental one, but he was also a pragmatist. How could he solve this problem efficiently, permanently? He needed to protect the girl from her stepfather. He needed to fund her surgery, the best surgery with the best doctors in the world. And he needed to do it in a way that satisfied his grandmother's demand for honorable repayment. And as he walked the silent, sterile corridors, a plan began to form. A cold, logical, and audacious plan that would solve everything. It would solve the problem of Alara Vance. It would satisfy the debt. And it would solve another, more persistent problem in his life, the relentless, cloying attentions of Vanessa Langdon, a woman from a prominent family to whom he was loosely and unhappily betrothed. He found Alara's room and paused outside the door, composing himself. He was no longer the irritated driver from the storm. He was Damien Blackwood, CEO, here to close a deal. He knocked once before entering. Alara was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked small and lost in the large, empty room. Her head snapped up at the sound of the door. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Yes," he said, closing the door behind him. The soft click seemed to seal them in. He walked to the foot of the bed, his presence filling the space. "I know who you are, Alara." She tensed. "I don't understand. I know about your stepfather, Marcus Thorne. I know he stole the money for your surgery." He stated, his voice flat and factual. "And I know that you are the woman who saved my grandmother's life 2 months ago." Alara's face went pale. She had never connected the woman she helped with this powerful, intimidating man. The world suddenly felt terrifyingly small. "I didn't do it for a reward," she whispered. "I know," he said. And for the first time there was a different note in his voice, something less harsh. "You did it and expected nothing, and in the process you lost everything. That has created a debt. My family pays its debts." He let that sink in before continuing. "I am prepared to offer you a solution to your problems. All of them. I will fund your surgery with the best specialists in the world. I will provide you with a home where you will be safe. I will ensure your stepfather never bothers you again. I will in essence give you back your life." Alara's heart began to beat faster. It was too much too good to be true. There was a catch. There was always a catch. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want from me?" Damien met her unfocused gaze, his own expression unreadable. "I want you to marry me." The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a still pond. Alara recoiled as if he had slapped her. She shook her head in disbelief, a strangled sound escaping her lips. "What? No. You can't be serious." "I am perfectly serious," he said, his voice returning to its cool, businesslike tone. "Let me be clear. This would be a contract, not a romance. A mutually beneficial transaction. My grandmother wishes to see me settled, and I have obligations I wish to be free of. A wife would solve those problems. You require safety, security, and extensive medical care. I can provide those things. We would be married for 1 year. At the end of that year, we will divorce amicably. You will be financially secure, your sight will be restored, and you will be free to go. No emotions, no attachments. It is by all accounts the most efficient solution." She was speechless, her mind reeling from the audacity of his proposal. He was talking about marriage the way he would talk about a corporate merger. He wanted to buy her, to use her as a shield, a social convenience. I am not a thing to be bought," she said, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "No," he agreed, a hint of respect in his tone. "You are a woman who saved my grandmother's life. This is not about buying you. This is about repaying a debt in a way that honors its magnitude. Think about it, Alara. What are your other options? Return to a man who abuses you, live on the streets. My offer is a cage, yes, but it is a gilded one, and outside its bars are wolves. The choice is yours." He stood in silence, waiting. He had laid his terms on the table. He had presented the unvarnished, brutal truth of her situation and offered a single, extraordinary way out. Alara sat on the edge of the bed, the clean, sterile scent of the hospital filling her lungs, her world once again reduced to a single, impossible choice. The storm outside had passed, but she knew with a chilling certainty that she was standing in the eye of a much larger hurricane. The silence in the hospital room stretched thin and taut, pulled between Damien's unyielding presence and Ilara's reeling thoughts. A gilded cage. He had described it perfectly. An escape from the wolves, but an escape into a form of captivity she couldn't yet comprehend. She thought of Marcus, of the cold rain, of the gnawing, endless hunger that had been her constant companion for 3 years. Then she thought of this man's offer: safety, warmth, a chance to see the world. It wasn't a choice between freedom and bondage. It was a choice between survival and a slow, inevitable demise. Freedom had been an illusion for a long time. "I have one condition," she said, her voice quiet but firm, surprising even herself. Damien's eyebrow arched slightly, a minimal sign of his surprise. "I'm listening." "My stepfather, Marcus." She said the name tasting like poison. "You said you would ensure he never bothers me again. I don't want him just pushed away. I want him to answer for what he did, for the money, for everything." A lifetime of swallowed pain was in that single, simple request. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed Damien's features. He had expected her to bargain for money, for assets. Instead, she had asked for justice. "Consider it done," he said. It was a promise made with the chilling certainty of a man who could move mountains, or in this case make a single pathetic man disappear into the maw of the legal system. He will be audited, investigated, and prosecuted for every crime he has ever committed, starting with the theft of your funds. That was it, the final weight on the scales. She took a deep, shuddering breath and gave a single decisive nod. "I agree to your terms." Damien's response was immediate and efficient. He pulled out his phone, and with a few terse words to his assistant, the machinery of his world whirred into motion. Less than an hour later, a man in a flawlessly tailored suit, whom she would come to know as Alex, entered the room carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself politely, his voice as neutral and precise as a metronome. Inside the portfolio was the contract. It was a thick document of heavy cream-colored paper smelling faintly of ink and money. Ilara could not see the dense blocks of text, but she could feel the weight of it in her hands. It felt like a gravestone. As you are visually impaired, I will read the key articles aloud for you. Alex said, his tone making it clear this was a legal formality, not an act of compassion. He read through the clauses in a steady monotone. The duration of the marriage, 365 days. The financial settlement upon the successful completion of the contract and subsequent divorce, a sum so large it sounded like a random collection of numbers. Her duties and obligations to present herself as his wife in all public and private family settings, to maintain absolute confidentiality regarding the nature of their agreement to reside in his primary residence. His obligations to provide for all her medical, residential, and personal needs, and to ensure her complete protection from Marcus Thorne and any other external threats. It was the coldest, most impersonal document she had ever imagined, a meticulous blueprint for the construction of a lie. When Alex finished, he produced a pen. "If you would sign here, Miss Vance." He gently took her hand and guided her fingers to the correct line. Her signature, once a simple representation of her name, now felt like the signing away of her soul. The scratch of the pen on the thick paper was the only sound in the room, a small final sound sealing the most significant transaction of her life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of clinical efficiency. Damien was true to his word. A team of the world's leading ophthalmologists was flown in. They spoke to Alara in calm, confident tones, explaining the intricate procedure, the risks, and the potential outcomes. They never promised a miracle, only a possibility. For Alara, possibility was more than she had dared to hope for. The surgery itself was a void, a period of anesthetized nothingness. Her re-entry into the world began in darkness, her eyes swathed in thick bandages. The first few days were a trial of patience, a waiting game played in a world of muffled sounds and the scent of antiseptic. Damien did not visit. Instead, a private nurse attended to her every need. Her presence a constant professional reminder of his detached influence. The day the bandages came off, the lead surgeon, Dr. Alistair Finch, was there. He removed them with practiced ease, his voice a low murmur. "Now don't be alarmed, Alara. Your brain hasn't processed visual information in a long time. It's going to be overwhelming. Just open your eyes slowly." She did as she was told. At first there was nothing. Then a violent, painful explosion of light. It was a physical assault, a searing, white-hot agony that made her cry out and squeeze her eyes shut. "It's all right," Dr. Finch soothed. "That's normal. The pupils are reacting. Let's try again, but just a slit." She tried again, forcing her eyelids to part by a mere fraction. The world rushed in not as a clear picture, but as a chaotic, terrifying riot of sensation. It was a sea of bleeding colors, indistinct shapes that swam and shifted with no logic or form. The doctor's face was a pale, blurry oval. The white of his coat was so bright it hurt to look at. The room was a confusing jumble of light and shadow, and the sheer volume of new information sent a spike of pain through her head. It wasn't the beautiful, tearful revelation she had seen in movies. It was nauseating, disorienting, and profoundly frightening. Over the next week, she learned to see again. Her new world was a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Shapes had soft, blurry edges. Colors were muted in the distance, but overwhelmingly vibrant up close. Reading was impossible, and faces were recognizable only by the general shape of a head and the color of hair. The constant effort of trying to focus left her with debilitating headaches. Her miracle was a fractured, imperfect thing. It had not given her freedom. It had simply made her dependent in a new and more complicated way. The day she was discharged from the hospital, Damien came to collect her himself. He was an imposing figure, a tall, sharp-edged silhouette of dark gray and black. He said little, simply nodding to the nurse before leading her out of the room, his hand resting lightly on her elbow. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of guidance, like a man leading a prized but unpredictable horse. The ride to his home was conducted in a tense silence, broken only by the quiet murmur of the news on the radio and the occasional low vibration of Damien's phone as he answered text messages. Alara stared out the window, watching the city slide by in a blur of motion and color that made her feel dizzy. They left the dense urban landscape behind, passing through a set of imposing black iron gates, and into a different world. A long, winding driveway snaked through a meticulously manicured landscape of ancient trees and geometric gardens. The house, when it came into view, was not the grand, welcoming manner she might have imagined. It was a fortress of modern architecture, a breathtaking and intimidating structure of dark stone, gleaming glass, and severe, clean lines. It looked less like a home and more like the headquarters of a powerful, shadowy corporation. Inside, the impression of cold, sterile power only intensified. The front door opened into a cavernous two-story foyer. The floors were polished black marble that reflected the muted light from a massive abstract chandelier high above. The air was cool and still, and every sound, the click of her shoes, the soft thud of the closing door echoed in the vast empty space. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of life. The furniture was sparse and sculptural pieces of art that offered no invitation to sit, no hint of comfort. Ilara, with her fragmented vision, felt utterly dwarfed and lost. The scale of the place was overwhelming. It was a world of vast, blurry planes and sharp, dangerous-looking angles. A woman in a crisp gray uniform appeared as if from nowhere. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood." "Ma'am." Her face was a polite, impersonal mask. "Mrs. Albright." "This is Ilara Damien," said his tone flat. "She will be staying here. Please show her to the guest suite in the East Wing. See to it that she has everything she needs." He was already turning away, pulling his phone from his pocket. The problem had been solved, the package delivered. Now he could return to his real life. "Wait," Ilara said, her voice small in the echoing hall. He stopped and looked back at her. "My room, I thought. Your own suite will be ready in a few days," he said dismissively. "This will be more than adequate for now." He didn't wait for a reply before striding away down a long corridor, his footsteps sharp and decisive on the marble floor. Left alone with the housekeeper, Ilara felt a profound sense of isolation settle over her. She was a guest, an object to be managed, an item on a checklist. Mrs. Albright led her through silent, museum-like hallways to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire house she had grown up in. But the luxury was as cold and impersonal as everything else. She was standing in the center of the enormous living room, trying to make sense of the blurry shapes of the white sofa and glass coffee table, when a new sound intruded. The sharp, rapid click of high heels on the marble floor outside, growing closer at an alarming rate. It was followed by a loud, imperious voice. "Damien, where are you? The staff said you were home. I simply couldn't believe—" The voice cut off as a figure appeared in the doorway of the suite. From Ilara's perspective, it was a slash of vibrant, aggressive red against the muted tones of the hallway. The scent of a heavy, cloying floral perfume washed over her. The woman stepped into the room, and even with Ilara's poor vision, there was no mistaking the hostility radiating from her. "Well, well," the woman said, her voice dripping with condescension as her eyes raked Ilara up and down. "What do we have here? I heard Damien picked up a stray, but I didn't imagine it would be quite so pathetic." "Let me guess. You're the charity case." Ilara stiffened her hands, clenching into fists at her sides. "I don't know who you are," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course you don't," the woman scoffed, taking another step closer. "People like you don't move in circles where the name Vanessa Langdon means anything. I am Damien's fiancée. Or I was, until he apparently developed a taste for rescuing bedraggled little nobodies from the gutter." Every word was a carefully aimed dart designed to wound. Before Ilara could formulate a response, Damien's voice, cold as ice, cut through the tension. "That's enough, Vanessa." He appeared in the doorway behind her, his presence instantly changing the dynamic of the room. He was no longer the detached businessman. He was a predator whose territory had been invaded. Vanessa spun around, her expression shifting to one of wounded indignation. "Damien, darling, what is the meaning of this? Who is this girl?" "She is Ilara Vance," Damien said, walking into the room to stand beside Ilara. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a clear statement. "And she is my future wife. You will treat her with the respect that position commands." Vanessa's perfectly painted mouth fell open. The shock on her face was almost comical, quickly replaced by a furious, mottled flush. "Your wife? You can't be serious. You're replacing me with her. Our engagement was a business arrangement, and you know it." "It is no longer a viable one," Damien said coldly. "This is my house. Ilara is my guest. You are not. I suggest you leave." The dismissal was absolute. Vanessa stared at him, then shot Ilara a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a promise of future retribution. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out her angry footsteps echoing down the long hall until they faded into silence. The room fell quiet once more. Ilara stood frozen, her heart pounding from the confrontation. Damien had defended her, but it had not felt like a rescue. It had felt like a declaration of ownership. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing her firmly on his side, but within a perimeter she was not allowed to leave. "You'll have to get used to that," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "My world has many people like her. Do not engage. Do not show weakness. Understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He seemed to accept this, turning to leave. "Mrs. Albright will arrange for your meals. Rest. Your new life begins now." He left her alone in the vast, silent suite. Ilara walked on unsteady feet to the wall of glass that served as the room's outer wall. The city lights glittered below a million blurry, beautiful diamonds scattered on black velvet. It was a view that cost a fortune, a view of a world at her feet. She reached out and pressed her palm against the cool, smooth surface of the glass. It was a solid, unyielding barrier between her and everything she had ever known. She had escaped the storm, but she had been locked in a beautiful, empty tower. The gilded bars of her cage were finally firmly in place. The days in the Blackwood mansion bled into one another, each marked by the same oppressive silence and luxurious emptiness. Ilara's new life was a paradox of immense privilege and profound isolation. She lived in a suite of rooms so vast that her own footsteps echoed back at her, a solitary ghost in a palace of glass and stone. Her meals were served on delicate porcelain by silent staff in a dining room that could have hosted a state dinner, yet she always ate alone. Her world was a constant, exhausting exercise in adaptation. With her vision still a frustrating tapestry of blurs and shifting light, she learned the geography of the house through touch and sound. She would trail her fingertips along the cool, smooth walls, memorizing the turns of the corridors. She learned to distinguish the staff by the cadence of their footsteps. Mrs. Albright's were sharp and efficient. The cook's were a heavy, shuffling tread, and the younger maids were light and hurried. They were all professionally polite, their voices never rising above a deferential murmur, but Ilara felt their eyes on her constantly. She could hear the whispers that ceased the moment she entered a room, the subtle shift in the air that signaled her presence as an unwelcome anomaly. She was not the lady of the house. She was the master's strange temporary acquisition. Damien was a phantom. He left before she woke his departure, marked only by the distant growl of his Bentley, and returned long after she had retired to her room, the scent of his cologne in the hallway, the only evidence of his return. He was the architect of her new reality, yet he remained almost entirely absent from it, a powerful invisible force dictating the terms of her gilded imprisonment. Vanessa, however, was a different kind of phantom. After their initial confrontation, she was forbidden from the house, but her presence lingered like the cloying scent of her perfume. Her campaign against Ilara was not one of open assault, but of insidious, subtle warfare. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, each one designed to make Ilara seem incompetent, clumsy, and unworthy. One afternoon, navigating the vast, white-carpeted sunroom, Ilara's knee connected sharply with a small, low-lying table that had not been there the day before. A bottle of red wine left precariously on its edge toppled over, shattering on the marble hearth and splashing a violent, blood-red stain across the pristine white rug. Mrs. Albright appeared instantly, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line as she surveyed the damage. Ilara's stammered apologies felt hollow and foolish. She could not prove the table had been moved, and the incident was logged in the staff's collective memory as yet another mark against the clumsy blind girl. Another time, a silk runner in a dimly lit hallway was subtly wrinkled, just enough to catch her toe and send her stumbling. She caught herself before she fell, but not before a passing maid saw her. The girl's gasp of alarm quickly masked by a neutral expression. The whispers followed her down the hall. These small, orchestrated mishaps chipped away at her confidence, making her second-guess her own senses and movements. She felt as though she were losing her mind, a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand, played by an opponent she could not see. Just when the oppressive loneliness threatened to consume her, a fragile, almost imperceptible connection began to form in the space between her and Damien. It was not built on words, but on quiet observation. One evening, unable to sleep, Ilara found her way to the library. It was the one room in the house that felt warm, the walls lined with the blurry shapes of thousands of books. the air thick with the scent of leather and old paper. The mansion's advanced audio system was controlled by voice command. On a whim, she whispered the name of a complex classical sonata her mother used to love. The first notes of the piano, melancholic and beautiful, filled the silence. She sank into a deep leather armchair, closed her eyes, and let the music wash over her, a rare moment of peace in her turbulent new life. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, but when the piece ended, a deep voice from the shadows of the doorway made her jump. "Schubert," Damien said. It wasn't a question. She turned her head towards the sound of his voice, her heart hammering. Yes, the piano sonata in B-flat major. He stepped into the room, a tall, dark silhouette against the light of the hall. "It was my father's favorite." He said nothing more, but he stayed leaning against a bookshelf as she requested another piece, and then another. They sat in the vast, dark room for nearly an hour, sharing a space without sharing a conversation. The music a bridge across the chasm of their strange arrangement. It was the most time she had ever spent in his presence. The next afternoon, she returned to her suite to find that a state-of-the-art voice-activated audio player had been installed, along with a device that gave her access to a library of thousands of audiobooks and musical compositions. There was no note, no explanation. It was a gesture of stark, impersonal kindness, a solution to a problem he had observed. He had seen her isolation and, in his own detached way, had provided a tool to combat it. The gesture touched a part of her she thought had gone numb. For the first time, she felt seen not as a charity case or a contractual obligation, but as a person with needs. A sliver of hope, fragile as a spider's thread, began to spin within her. This fragile truce, however, was precisely what Vanessa could not abide. Seeing that her subtle torments were not enough, she escalated her campaign, aiming for a wound that would be not only deep, but fatal to the burgeoning trust between Ilara and Damien. Her target was the one thing Ilara could not have known was sacred Damien's private study. The study was his sanctuary, the one room in the mansion that was truly his. It was kept locked, and the staff had been given ironclad instructions that no one, absolutely no one, was to enter without his explicit permission. Vanessa's opportunity came during a rare afternoon when Damien was working from home. Using a carefully constructed lie whispered to a sympathetic friend on the staff, a message was relayed. Mrs. Albright, her face a mask of professional neutrality, found Ilara in the conservatory. "Ma'am," the housekeeper said, "Mr. Blackwood has requested your presence. He is waiting for you in his study." Ilara's breath caught. He had never summoned her before. A nervous flutter started in her stomach. Was this a good sign? A step forward? She followed Mrs. Albright through the silent halls to a heavy oak door she had never seen open. The housekeeper knocked once, then pushed it open for her. "He is just finishing a call. He asked that you wait for him inside," Mrs. Albright said, before turning and walking away, her footsteps retreating into silence. Hesitantly, Ilara stepped across the threshold. The room smelled different from the rest of the house. It was a warm, masculine scent of old books, rich leather, and the faint, clean fragrance of Damien's cologne. It felt like the heart of the mansion, the soul of the man who owned it. The door clicked softly shut behind her, plunging the room into a dim light, the heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Her blurry vision slowly adjusted. She could make out the massive shape of a desk, the towering forms of bookshelves. Her hand traced the edge of the desk, her fingers brushing against cool, smooth wood. And then she saw it. On the corner of the desk, catching what little light there was a silver frame. It was the only personal item she could discern in the entire room. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, a desire to understand the man whose life she was now a part of, she reached out. Her fingers gently touched the cool metal. This was a piece of him, a piece of his past. She wanted to feel a connection, to understand the man behind the cold corporate facade. It happened in an instant. A sudden violent bang echoed from somewhere else in the house, like a heavy door slamming into its frame. The unexpected sound made Ilara flinch violently. Her hand jerked her arm, knocking against the silver frame. She heard a sickening crash as it tumbled from the desk, followed by the sharp, crystalline tinkle of shattering glass on the hardwood floor. Panic seized her. "Oh no," she whispered, dropping to her knees, her hands sweeping across the floor, searching for the pieces. Her fingers brushed against a sharp shard of glass, and she hissed in pain, pulling her hand back. It was at that exact damning moment that the study door opened. Damien stood there, his face a thundercloud. His eyes, cold and piercing, took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, the open door to his forbidden sanctuary, Ilara on her knees, and the shattered frame of his parents' photograph lying between them. The photograph, the only one he had left. The smiling faces of the parents he had lost so young now lying amidst a spiderweb of broken glass. His carefully controlled exterior disintegrated not into a fiery rage, but into something far more terrifying, a glacial, lethal cold. What he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you doing in here?" "Damien, I'm so sorry," Ilara stammered, trying to get to her feet. "The housekeeper, she told me you wanted to see me. There was a noise, it startled me, and It was an accident." He walked slowly into the room, his eyes fixed on the devastation on the floor. He didn't even look at her. "Mrs. Albright knows my rules. And I did not summon you." He crouched down and carefully picked up the wooden frame, the photograph of his smiling parents staring up at him. "This was the only room in this entire house I asked you to respect. The only thing I asked was for my privacy. I didn't mean to," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes, blurring her already imperfect vision into a meaningless smear of light and shadow. "Please, you have to believe me." He finally looked at her, and his expression made her soul turn to ice. All the suspicion he had harbored from the beginning, all the cynical mistrust of his nature, had returned with a vengeance. He saw a liar, a trespasser, who had pried into his life and through carelessness or malice had destroyed the one thing he treasured. The fragile connection they had built over shared music and quiet gestures was gone, incinerated in this single devastating moment. "I believe what I see," he said, his voice flat and empty. "And I see my trust and my property broken on the floor." He stood up, turning his back on her, a gesture of dismissal more absolute than any shout. He walked over to a small table, placing the frame down with a quiet finality. The emotional gulf between them had become a vast, uncrossable canyon. "Get out," he said without looking at her. The two words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Shaking her heart shattered into a million pieces, Ilara stumbled out of the room, leaving him alone with his broken memories. The whispers and lies had won. In the gilded cage, she was more alone and more trapped than ever before. The aftermath of the broken photograph was a descent into a cold, silent war. The vast echoing spaces of the Blackwood mansion, which had once felt merely empty, now felt heavy with unspoken accusations. Damien moved through the house like a specter of his former self, his presence marked by a chilling, absolute withdrawal. He did not speak to Ilara unless it was unavoidable, and when he did, his words were clipped, impersonal, and stripped of all emotion. The fragile bridge of shared music and quiet understanding they had begun to build had been obliterated. Now there was only a chasm of mistrust, and Ilara was stranded on one side, utterly alone. She tried once to approach him as he was reviewing some documents in the formal living room. "Damien," she began, her voice tentative, "can we please talk about what happened? I need you to know I would never intentionally." "There is nothing to talk about." He cut her off, his eyes never leaving the page. "What's done is done. Be more careful in the future." The dismissal was so complete, so devoid of feeling that it felt more brutal than any angry outburst could have. It told her that she was not worth the energy of an argument. Their contractual charade became a masterpiece of hypocrisy. His grandmother Eleanor, still recovering but in high spirits, insisted on weekly video calls. The moment the screen flickered to life, Damien would transform. A mask of placid affection would slip over his features. He would sit beside Ilara on the sofa sometimes, even placing a proprietary hand on her shoulder, and speak warmly of her progress. "She's adjusting wonderfully, grandmother," he would say, his voice smooth as silk. "Her vision improves every day. The house is brighter with her in it." Ilara would sit, frozen, a silent participant in the lie, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder feeling like a brand. The instant the call ended, the mask would vanish. His hand would withdraw, the temperature in the room would drop 20 degrees, and he would rise and walk away without a backward glance, leaving her reeling from the dizzying performance. While his home life devolved into a state of frozen conflict, Damien threw himself into his work with a renewed, almost feral intensity. The unsolved mystery of his grandmother's hit-and-run gnawed at him. It was a loose end, an unacceptable breach of the secure world he had built. He poured resources into the investigation, hiring the best private intelligence firm in the country to supplement the police's efforts. It was a tangible problem, a puzzle of logic and facts, a welcome distraction from the messy, emotional quagmire of his marriage. Yet every lead turned into a dead end. The car, a stolen sedan, had been found torched in an abandoned lot, wiped clean of any forensic evidence. The driver, a shadowy figure caught on a single grainy security camera, was a ghost. There were no witnesses, no chatter on the criminal underground. The entire event seemed to have been executed with a level of professionalism that was deeply unsettling. Frustrated and at a dead end, Damien turned to the one person he had always trusted implicitly, the man who had been a rock for him since his own father's death, his uncle Julian Blackwood. Julian was his father's younger brother, a man who possessed all the charm and warmth that Damien lacked. Where Damien was a creature of the stark, modern boardroom, Julian was a throwback to an older world of quiet influence and refined taste. They met at Julian's private club, an oasis of dark mahogany aged leather and whispered conversations. Julian greeted his nephew with a warm embrace, his brow furrowed with concern. "Damien, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Tell me what's wrong." Over glasses of amber scotch, Damien laid out his frustrations with the investigation, the professional execution of the crime, the complete lack of leads. Julian listened patiently, his handsome, cultured face a perfect portrait of empathy. He swirled the liquor in his glass, letting the silence hang in the air for a long moment after Damien had finished. "It's troubling," Julian said at last, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. "Deeply troubling. The lack of a motive is what I find most curious. A common street criminal would have snatched Eleanor's purse. A professional kidnapper would have grabbed her. This feels different." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Damien's. "This feels theatrical. As if the point wasn't the attack itself, but the rescue." The word hung in the air between them. Damien stared at his uncle, a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. "What are you suggesting?" Julian sighed, a masterful performance of reluctance. "Nephew, I hesitate to even voice this thought. It's monstrous, but in our world we must consider every angle, no matter how distasteful. Have you considered that the accident wasn't an attack on Eleanor at all? What if it was simply a means to an end?" He let the implication sink in. He didn't need to say Alara's name. The connection was immediate, insidious, and terrifyingly logical to Damien's already suspicious mind. A staged accident, a perfectly timed rescue, a gateway into the impenetrable fortress of the Blackwood family. The broken photograph, which had seemed like an act of profound carelessness, suddenly looked like an act of arrogant disrespect from someone who felt they had already won. "That's impossible," Damien said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Julian countered gently. "Think about the girl's situation. A desperate, blind young woman with a degenerate gambler for a stepfather. A man who would do anything for money. What if he was the architect? He arranges a near miss, his stepdaughter plays the hero, and in one fell swoop, she is embraced by one of the wealthiest families in the country. It's a plot worthy of a novel, I admit, but life can be stranger than fiction." Damien's world began to tilt. Julian's theory was a poison perfectly formulated to attack the weakest points in his psyche. It preyed on his inherent cynicism, his belief that everyone had an angle, and it validated the cold anger he felt over the broken photograph. As if sensing his nephew's wavering resolve, Julian reached for a slim leather briefcase at his side. "I had my own people look into this Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice soft with regret. "I felt it was my duty to protect the family. I'm afraid they found something." He slid a folder across the polished table. Damien opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a copy of a bank statement from an offshore account belonging to Marcus Thorne. It showed a single anonymous wire transfer for a significant sum of money deposited just 2 days before Eleanor's accident. "It's likely nothing," Julian said, the very picture of feigned nonchalance. "The man is a gambler. Money flows in and out. But the timing, it's a curious coincidence, isn't it?" It was more than curious. It was a smoking gun. To Damien's analytical mind, it was a piece of data that connected two disparate events. It was the missing motive. It was the piece that made the entire ugly puzzle fit together. "I hope to God I'm wrong," Julian said, placing a comforting hand on his nephew's shoulder. "For your sake and for the sake of that poor girl, I truly do. But we cannot afford to be naive." Damien returned to the mansion late that night, the folder from Julian feeling like a lead weight in his hand. The house was dark and silent. He walked down the long corridor, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He paused outside Alara's suite, his hand hovering near the doorknob before he pulled it back and continued on to his study. He switched on a single desk lamp, bathing the room in a pool of warm light. The broken photograph was still on the side table, where he had left it, a stark reminder of his shattered trust. He placed Julian's folder beside it. The two objects sat there side by side, the symbol of his cherished past and the symbol of a potentially treacherous present. His mind, trained to see patterns and calculate risks, began to connect the dots, weaving a narrative of breathtaking deception. The next morning, he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his bedroom, which overlooked the expansive gardens. Below, a small figure in a simple dress was sitting on a stone bench. It was Alara. The early morning sun warmed her face, and from this distance, with her head tilted back and a soft, peaceful expression on her features, she looked like a portrait of pure innocence. But the poison had taken root. Damien looked at her truly. Looked at her. And for the first time, he didn't see the girl who had stumbled out of the storm. He didn't see the woman who had saved his grandmother. He didn't see the quiet companion who listened to Schubert in the dark. He saw a question mark, an unknown variable in a high-stakes equation. He saw the face of a beautiful, masterful lie. Julian's shadow had fallen over her, casting her every action in a sinister new light. Her vulnerability now seemed like a tactic, her gentleness a performance. Damien stood at the window, a prisoner in his own home, trapped in a web of doubt, spun by the one man he believed he could trust. And as he watched the woman who was his wife, a cold resolve hardened within him. He would play her game, watch her every move, and wait for her to make a mistake. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Ball was not merely a party. It was a command performance, the glittering centerpiece of the city's social calendar. It was a carefully calibrated display of power, wealth, and philanthropy, and for the Blackwood family, attendance was not optional. 2 weeks before the event, Eleanor summoned Damien for a meeting, her voice over the phone leaving no room for argument. "Damien, this year's ball is more important than ever," she stated, her tone crisp. "It will be your first major public appearance with Alara. The city needs to see a united front. They need to see that the future of this family is stable and secure. You will attend, and you will present your wife to the world." Damien agreed, his voice a cool, steady monotone. Inside, however, a dark satisfaction coiled in his gut. His grandmother, in her desire for social cohesion, had unwittingly provided him with the perfect stage. A high-pressure public arena was the ideal laboratory in which to test his hypothesis. He would watch Alara observe her every move under the glare of 1,000 lights, and wait for the mask of her supposed innocence to crack. For Alara, the news was a death sentence. The thought of facing hundreds of staring, judging people, of navigating a swirling sea of strangers with her imperfect vision, was terrifying. She was a pawn in Damien's game, a doll to be dressed up and displayed, and the ball was to be her public unveiling. The day of the event, the mansion was overrun by a team of strangers. Damien had hired stylists, hairdressers, and makeup artists who descended upon her like a flock of exotic chattering birds. They poked, prodded, and painted her, transforming her with an impersonal efficiency that left her feeling completely detached from her own body. They encased her in a gown of deep sapphire silk that felt like cool water against her skin. It was exquisitely beautiful, but it felt like a costume for a role she had never auditioned for. Diamonds, cold and heavy, were fastened around her neck and on her ears, their unfamiliar weight, a constant reminder of the alien world she now inhabited. When they were finished, she was led to the top of the grand staircase to await Damien. As she stood there, her reflection was a blurry, elegant stranger in the massive gilt mirror on the landing. She saw a sweep of dark hair, the brilliant blue of the dress, the sparkle of jewels. She looked the part of Mrs. Damien Blackwood, but the woman inside was screaming. Damien ascended the stairs, stopping a few feet below her. He was impossibly handsome in a classic black tuxedo, his presence radiating a power that seemed to suck the very air from the space around him. His eyes swept over her, and for a single unguarded moment his mask of cold indifference faltered. He saw not the calculating schemer his uncle had painted, but the girl from the storm, her vulnerability now wrapped in silk and diamonds. Her beauty was startling, and the profound sadness in her posture struck him with the force of an unexpected blow. A flicker of doubt, hot and sharp, pierced through his armor of suspicion. What if Julian was wrong? What if she was exactly what she appeared to be, a victim, not a predator? Then he remembered the bank statement. He remembered the shattered photograph of his parents. He crushed the flicker of doubt with brutal efficiency, reminding himself that a skilled actress could play any part. His expression hardened once more. "You look acceptable," he said, his voice coolly appraising. He offered his arm. "Try not to be clumsy with the champagne. The photographers are ruthless." His touch was like ice against her bare skin. She placed her hand on his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. He was a cold, hard anchor, and as they descended the stairs and walked out into the cool night air, she knew she was about to be cast into a storm, far worse than the one that had first thrown them together. The ballroom was a sensory inferno. Ilara was immediately assaulted by a wall of noise, the roar of hundreds of conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, the swell of a live orchestra that crashed over her in a disorienting wave. The air was thick with 1,000 competing perfumes, and the heat from the crush of bodies was suffocating. Worst of all were the lights. Blinding flashes from the paparazzi on the red carpet exploded in her sensitive eyes, leaving painful dancing spots in her vision. She clung to Damien's arm, her only point of stability, in a swirling, chaotic world. He navigated the room with the effortless grace of a shark in its native waters, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. His grip on her elbow, a firm, controlling pressure. They were swarmed by people whose faces were indistinct blurs, their voices a meaningless stream of pleasantries and veiled questions. Ilara murmured polite responses, her own smile feeling like a fragile, cracking mask. "Smile," Ilara. Damien's voice was a low command in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "The world is watching." She felt like an animal in a zoo, an exotic creature on display for the amusement of the wealthy and powerful. Every polite inquiry about her health, her background, her whirlwind romance with the city's most eligible bachelor felt like a cross-examination. She could feel Vanessa Langdon's hateful gaze on her from across the room, a palpable malevolent force. She saw Julian approach them, his smile warm and avuncular as he kissed her hand and told Damien how lucky he was. The hypocrisy was nauseating. The true ambush came an hour later. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the crowd. Julian Blackwood, looking every bit the distinguished philanthropist, took the stage. "Good evening, friends." He began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Tonight is about celebrating the work of the Blackwood Foundation. And to kick off our presentation, we have a short video highlighting the very real human impact of our community outreach programs." He gestured to the massive screen behind him. The crowd applauded politely. Ilara stood beside Damien, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The screen flickered to life. But it was not a slick, professionally produced charity video. It was grainy, shaky footage clearly filmed in secret. It showed a quiet, grimy alleyway, and then a figure walked into the frame. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. It was her. The dress was one she recognized from a few weeks ago from a rare afternoon when she had felt brave enough to walk to a small park near the mansion. The audio was distorted, but her voice was audible. Words were taken out of context, stitched together to form a damning narrative. "The old woman. It went perfectly. Just as we planned. I'll get the rest of the money after it's settled." Then a man stepped out of the shadows. His face was obscured, but he handed her a thick white envelope. The camera zoomed in as her hands took it. The video then cut to a single clear, still image, the face of the man. It was the same face from the police's security footage of the hit-and-run driver. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight of shock and disbelief. On the screen, Ilara was frozen, caught in the act of accepting a payoff from the man who had nearly killed Eleanor Blackwood. Before the stunned silence could break, a new commotion erupted from the back of the room. A figure, drunk and disheveled, shoved his way through the horrified guests, shouting, "It's true, every word of it. She planned the whole thing." Ilara's blood ran cold. It was Marcus. Her stepfather, his face blotchy with drink and malice, pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her. Julian and Vanessa had found him. They had brought him here. "She told me all about it." He slurred, stumbling forward. "Said it was a foolproof plan. Use the accident to save the old biddy, get her hooks into the rich boy. It was her idea from the start. It was a perfectly executed assassination. The video, the witness, the public stage. It was irrefutable. It was brilliant." All eyes in the room turned to one person, Damien. He stood perfectly still, his face carved from stone. He looked from the damning image on the screen to the pathetic shouting form of Marcus, and then finally to Alara. Her face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. Her lips were parted in a silent scream, her mind unable to process the sheer calculated cruelty of the betrayal. For a single agonizing heartbeat, Damien hesitated. A voice deep in his soul screamed at him. This is too perfect. This is a performance. Look at her. Look at her face. But the scream was drowned out by the roar of Julian's logic. The bank statement. The broken photograph. And now this. This public, undeniable, humiliating proof. The weight of the evidence was a physical force crushing the last vestiges of his doubt. His heart went cold, and his face hardened into a mask of impenetrable fury. Slowly, with a terrifying, deliberate calm, he reached down and unpeeled Alara's fingers from his arm. The gesture was small, but in the silent, watchful ballroom it was as loud as a gunshot. He took half a step away from her, creating a chasm between them. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a shout. It was far worse. It was quiet, clear, and dripping with a contempt that cut her to the bone. It seems he said his words, resonating with chilling finality, that I have been made a fool of. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding the captain of his security detail near the stage. Remove this woman from my sight. The command was absolute. 2 large men in dark suits moved toward her. Alara stood frozen for a moment, the single target of 1,000 staring, judging eyes. The faces of the crowd blurred into a single monstrous entity of scorn and morbid curiosity. The betrayal was so complete, so profound, it had propelled her beyond tears into a state of numb, silent shock. She didn't struggle as the guards took her arms. They escorted her through the stunned crowd which parted before them like the Red Sea. She was a pariah, a contaminant being cleansed from their pristine world. They didn't take her through the front entrance, but through a side door used for catering staff. The cold night air hit her face. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the noise and the light of the ballroom. She was standing on a dark, wet pavement behind the Grand Hotel alone. The distant mocking sound of the orchestra starting up again drifted through the walls. She was back where she started, cast out into the darkness. But this time the cage hadn't just been opened. It had been shattered around her, its gilded bars twisted into weapons that had shredded her soul. The cold night air was a slap shocking Alara out of her paralysis. One moment, she was the centerpiece of a glittering ballroom. The next, she was standing on a slick, dark pavement beside a row of overflowing dumpsters. The heavy service door clicked shut behind her, a final metallic sound of exile that severed her from that world as cleanly as a guillotine. She stood there for a long time, the distant thrum of the orchestra a faint, cruel mockery. The sapphire silk of her gown, which had felt so luxurious just an hour before, was now impossibly thin, offering no protection against the biting wind. The diamonds around her neck were not jewels, but a collar. A cold, heavy reminder of the man who had placed it there before publicly branding her a traitor. A state of numb shock enveloped her, a merciful buffer against the tidal wave of pain waiting to crash down. She began to walk with no destination in mind. Her slippered feet, so unsuited for the gritty city streets, carried her past the backs of darkened buildings through pools of garish neon light from lonely street lamps. She was a ghost in a borrowed costume, a bizarre spectacle for the few late-night drivers who slowed down to stare at the woman in the ball gown wandering through the city's forgotten corners. The numbness began to recede, and the pain flooded in, sharp and agonizing. The betrayal replayed in her mind in a torturous loop, the doctored video, Marcus's slurred accusations, and worst of all, Damien's face. The instant his features had hardened from confusion to cold conviction. The deliberate surgical way he had removed her hand from his arm. He hadn't just cast her out. He had dissected her soul in front of the entire world, holding up the pieces for ridicule and scorn. He had believed the lie without a moment's hesitation. Tears finally came hot and blinding, blurring her imperfect vision into a meaningless chaos of light and motion. She stumbled into the relative shelter of a bus stop, sinking onto the cold, hard bench. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably. She had nothing. No phone, no money, no home. She was back where she had been that first night in the storm, but this was infinitely worse. Then she had been a victim of circumstance. Now she was the victim of a calculated, soul-destroying act of cruelty. She was drowning in despair, the city a vast, indifferent ocean threatening to swallow her whole. And then a memory surfaced. a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. A face from a different life, a life before the gilded cage, before Marcus's cruelty had consumed everything. Maya. Her name was a spark of warmth. Maya, with her fiery red hair, her fierce, loyal eyes, and her laugh that could chase away any shadow. They had worked side by side at the weaver's market years ago. Maya had been the one who defended her from bullies, who taught her to haggle, who had always believed in her strength when Alara herself could not find it. Maya had a dream she had spoken of endlessly, to one day open her own bookstore, a cozy, chaotic sanctuary for lost souls and forgotten stories. She had even had a name for it: the Crooked Spine, hope fragile and desperate unfurled in Alara's chest. She remembered Maya talking about a neighborhood, a district known for its quirky independent shops. It was a long shot, a wild, improbable chance, but it was the only one she had. She stood up, her movements stiff. She looked down at her hands. The diamonds on her ears, they were her only currency. A taxi slowed as it approached the bus stop, its rooftop light a beacon. As it pulled to a stop, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary face, looked her up and down, his expression a mixture of suspicion and pity. "You all right, miss? I need to get to the artist's district," she said, her voice hoarse. "But I don't have any money." She fumbled with the clasp of one of the diamond earrings. It came free, cold, and sharp in her palm. "But I have this. It's worth a lot. More than enough for the fare. Please." The driver stared at the brilliant jewel sparkling in her hand, then back at her tear-streaked, desperate face. He was quiet for a long moment. He had seen a lot of strange things in his years driving a cab at night, but a Cinderella crying at a bus stop was a new one. He let out a long sigh. "Keep your earring, kid," he said, unlocking the doors. "Get in before you freeze to death. Just tell me where you're going." The bookstore was exactly as Maya had described it years ago. It was a small, brightly lit corner shop crammed between a closed laundromat and a bakery. The sign, painted in whimsical, slightly crooked letters, read, "The Crooked Spine." A light was still on inside, even though it was well past midnight. Alara paid the driver with a choked, heartfelt thank you and stumbled out of the cab. She pushed open the door, a small bell chiming her arrival. The air inside was warm and smelled divinely of old paper, brewing coffee, and cinnamon. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling, piled on tables overflowing from chairs. It was the complete antithesis of Damien's sterile mansion. It was a place that was loved, a place that was lived in. A figure with a wild mane of red hair looked up from behind the counter, a pair of glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Alara. Maya whispered, her glasses slipping down her nose. She stared, taking in the ball gown, the remaining jewels, the tear tracks, the utter desolation in her friend's face. "My God, what happened to you?" The sound of Maya's voice, the sheer unadulterated shock and concern in it, broke the last of Alara's composure. The dam of her grief burst, and she collapsed into sobs, great wrenching sounds of pain and betrayal. Maya was around the counter in an instant, her strong arms wrapping around Alara, holding her up. She didn't ask questions. She simply held her friend, murmuring words of comfort as she guided her through a beaded curtain into a small, cozy apartment at the back of the store. For 2 days, Maya cared for her. She drew a hot bath, dressed her in a soft, worn sweatshirt and sweatpants, and fed her hot, nourishing soup. She let Alara sleep for almost 20 hours straight in her own bed, and when Alara woke, she listened. She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression growing darker and more furious with every word, as Alara recounted the entire nightmarish story, the bargain, the gilded cage, the whispers and lies, and the final public execution at the ball. When Alara finished her voice, a raw whisper, Maya was silent for a long moment, her knuckles white where she gripped a coffee mug. "That man." Maya said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "He isn't a man. He's a monster. And that woman, Vanessa. I'd like to have 5 minutes alone with her in a dark alley." She took a deep breath, her pragmatism wrestling with her rage. She looked at Alara, whose eyes were hollow with despair. "Okay," Maya said, her tone shifting. "So the billionaire was a soulless monster and his friends are snakes. The world is full of them. Crying about it in my bed isn't going to fix a thing. The question is, Alara, what are you going to do now? Are you going to let him be the end of your story?" The words were blunt, almost harsh, but they were exactly what Alara needed to hear. They sliced through the fog of her victimhood and forced her to look forward. What was she going to do? The thought of hiding, of disappearing, and living a small, quiet life was tempting. But the memory of Damien's cold, contemptuous face, the memory of those hundreds of staring eyes, ignited something new inside her. It was not just pain, it was rage. A cold, quiet, and deeply motivating rage. She would not be a footnote in Damien Blackwood's life. She would not be a tragedy whispered about at cocktail parties. No, Alara said, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't felt in years. He will not be the end of my story. In that moment, something shifted. The broken, betrayed girl began to recede, and a new woman began to form in the crucible of her pain. She started to think not about what she had lost, but about what she had. Her unique experience. Her years of blindness had not been a weakness. They had been a form of training. She possessed an incredible memory for sound, a heightened sense of touch, an intuitive understanding of how to navigate the world through non-visual cues. An idea that had been a fleeting thought in the back of her mind for years, now exploded into life with brilliant clarity. Maya, she said, sitting up straighter, her eyes alive with a new light. People who can't see. We live in a world that wasn't built for us. The technology that's supposed to help is clumsy. It's robotic. It tells us there's an obstacle ahead. It doesn't tell you if that obstacle is a curb, a staircase, or a child's toy. It's not intuitive. She began to speak faster, the concept pouring out of her. But what if it could be? What if you could use advanced sound mapping and haptic feedback to create a kind of audio vision software that doesn't just describe the world, but lets you feel it? It could translate a visual landscape into a symphony of intuitive sounds and vibrations. It wouldn't just be a tool for navigation. It would be a tool for experiencing the world. Maya listened, her initial anger replaced by a growing sense of awe. This wasn't the timid, gentle Alara she had known. This was a visionary. Alara, Maya breathed. That's brilliant. I'm going to build it, Alara said with absolute certainty. I'm going to build a company that creates technology that actually understands us. I'm going to build a life so strong, so successful, that I will never be powerless again. The first step was to sever the last tie to her old life. The diamond necklace was still locked in its velvet box in Maya's safe. The next day, they took it to a discreet private jeweler in the city's financial district. The sum the jeweler offered them was staggering enough to change not just a life, but a future. It was the seed capital for their dream. They didn't rent a fancy corporate office. They cleared out the dusty, unused second floor above the crooked spine. They painted the walls themselves, hauled in second-hand furniture, and bought 2 powerful computers. They named their fledgling company Auratech, a name that signified seeing the invisible, perceiving the world through a different kind of light. The chapter of Alara Vance, the victim, was over. That night she sat not in a cavernous, lonely suite, but in a small, cluttered office, the scent of fresh paint and possibility in the air. The glow of a computer monitor illuminated her face. She couldn't see the screen clearly, but she didn't need to. Her fingers flew across a specialized tactile keyboard, translating the complex architecture of her idea into lines of code. Her posture was not one of despair, but of intense, focused creation. She was not a princess in a gilded cage or an exile in a storm. She was an architect, and she was building her own dawn. 3 years is a lifetime. For Alara Vance, it was the time it took to forge a new world from the ashes of the old one. The name Auratech was no longer a hopeful whisper in a dusty attic office. It was a disruptive force in the technology sector, a name spoken with a mixture of admiration and envy in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. Alara, once a phantom in a gilded cage, was now the company's visionary CEO. She moved not with the hesitant, shuffling steps of a victim, but with the confident, purposeful stride of a woman who knew her own worth. Her vision had never fully recovered. The world remained a watercolor painting, beautiful but lacking in sharp detail. Yet she had learned to navigate it with a grace that was its own form of sight. She could read the energy of a room, discern a person's intent from the cadence of their voice, and her mind, honed by years of reliance on memory and sound, was a formidable instrument. The protective wall around her heart was high and thick, but within it she had cultivated a quiet, unshakable strength. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had built. For Damien Blackwood, 3 years was a prison sentence served in the opulent cell of his own making. Outwardly, his empire flourished. Blackwood Corporation continued to dominate the market, his name still a synonym for ruthless success. But the man himself was a hollowed-out version of what he had been. The mansion, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a mausoleum, its silent, empty rooms echoing with his regrets. His relationship with Eleanor had grown brittle with unspoken truths. His grandmother had never explicitly condemned him for his actions at the ball, but a permanent chill had settled between them. She was polite, distant, and the easy affection that had once defined their bond was gone, replaced by a quiet, constant disappointment that was far worse than any argument. She had never believed the story, and her silent judgment was a weight he carried every day. He had never stopped searching for Alara. It was a secret, obsessive quest he kept hidden from everyone, especially from Julian. In a locked drawer of his desk, amidst files of corporate acquisitions and market analyses, lay a single grainy photograph taken by a private investigator a year after her disappearance. It showed her walking into a small bookstore, her face turned away from the camera. It was the last trace he'd had before the trail went cold. That photo, and the dozens of failed reports that accompanied it, were his private penance. He looked at it every night, the image of the woman he had publicly destroyed, a constant burning accusation. The first thread in the tapestry of lies began to unravel from the most unexpected of places. Eleanor, now in her 80s, was admitted to St. Jude's for a minor respiratory infection. During her stay, a senior nurse named Clara, a woman who had worked on the floor for 30 years and who remembered Alara's gentle gratitude during her own stay, came to sit with her one evening. Clara was nearing retirement, and her conscience was heavy. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, Mrs. Blackwood," she began, her voice low as she straightened Eleanor's blanket. "But something has always bothered me about what happened to that young woman, the one your grandson brought in from the storm." Eleanor's sharp eyes focused on her. "Go on, Clara." "A few days before that big charity gala 3 years ago, I saw Miss Langdon, Vanessa Langdon, here in the hospital. She was in a heated conversation with one of your younger maids, a girl named Sophie. Miss Langdon was doing all the talking, or rather, all the threatening. Her voice was like ice. I heard her say, 'You know what you have to do. If you fail, you'll be lucky to ever work in this city again.' The girl, Sophie, she looked terrified. It always seemed strange to me. I heard later that Sophie quit her job with your family and moved away right after the ball." The nurse's words were a small, simple observation, but for Eleanor, they were a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for 3 years. If Alara and her stepfather had been the masterminds, why would Vanessa be threatening a maid in the days leading up to their public exposure? It was a piece that didn't fit. The next day, she summoned Damien to her hospital suite. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "I never believed that girl was a villain, Damien," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I believe you were a fool blinded by arrogance and bad advice. I think it is time you stopped looking for enemies at your gates and started looking for the snakes that were already in your garden." She told him what the nurse had said. The information landed like a stone in the stagnant pool of Damien's guilt. It was an anomaly, an illogical data point that contradicted the seamless narrative Julian had so carefully constructed. His grandmother's words, a condemnation of his own monumental failure of judgment, jolted him out of his passive regret and into action. That evening, he did not hire his usual security team, the one with deep ties to his uncle. He made a call to a discreet, ruthless firm in Geneva, a group of corporate intelligence specialists known for their brutal efficiency and absolute lack of allegiance to anyone but their client. His instructions were simple and delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. "Your targets are Julian Blackwood and Vanessa Langdon. I want to know everything they have done for the past 4 years. Every financial transaction, every phone call, every email. Assume nothing. Trust no one on my staff. You report only to me." It was the unleashing of the hounds, and for the first time in 3 years, Damien was not just reacting to the past, he was hunting it. The truth, when it came, was not a trickle. It was an avalanche. The Swiss firm was everything he had paid for. Within a week, the first report landed on his desk. It was an encrypted file, a testament to the staggering depth of the betrayal. He opened it alone in his study, the very room where he had condemned Alara. The first file was a series of encrypted emails between Julian and Vanessa, their digital communications laid bare. He read their words, a sickening chronicle of their conspiracy from the initial planning stages to their gloating satisfaction after the ball. The second file contained financial records. His investigators had effortlessly bypassed the shell corporations and offshore accounts. They traced the payment to Marcus Thorne, not to some mysterious third party, but directly to an account secretly controlled by Julian Blackwood. The third file was the most damning. It was the original unedited security footage from the alleyway. Damien watched with a growing sense of horror as the scene played out, not as a payoff, but as an assault. The hit-and-run driver accosted Alara, trying to press the envelope into her hands, his voice a menacing whisper. He watched her throw the envelope back at him, her voice, though faint, clear in its rejection. "Leave me alone, I don't want your money." The video had not just been doctored, it had been inverted, its meaning twisted into a monstrous lie. The final report was a confession. The investigators had found the maid Sophie now living a quiet life in another state. Terrified but finally free from Vanessa's influence, she admitted everything: how Vanessa had paid her to lie to Alara to tell her that Damien was waiting in the study, and how she had been instructed to slam a door in the hallway at a precise moment to startle Alara into the accident with the photograph. The picture was now complete, a mural of treachery painted by the two people he had trusted most in the world. But one question remained. Why? The answer was in the final appendix, a detailed analysis of Julian's finances. His uncle, the man of old-world charm and wisdom, was on the verge of bankruptcy. A series of secret, catastrophic investments had wiped out his personal fortune. His plan had been born of pure, reptilian desperation. He would remove the independent, unpredictable Alara and install the easily controlled Vanessa as Damien's wife, securing his access and influence over the Blackwood Empire for years to come. The accident, the frame-up, the lies, it had all been a game for the highest stakes, with Alara as the designated sacrifice. Damien leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the stark lines of his face. The room was silent. He felt no rage, no desire for revenge. Those emotions were a luxury he hadn't earned. All he felt was the crushing, suffocating weight of the truth, the weight of his own colossal, public, and unforgivable mistake. He looked at the broken photograph of his parents still sitting on the side table. He had used it as a symbol of Alara's betrayal, when all along it had been a symbol of his own blindness. He had not just been a fool, he had been a willing one. He had allowed his pride, his suspicion, and his uncle's poison to overpower his own instincts. He had destroyed an innocent woman. He had cast out the one person who had shown his family selfless courage, and in doing so he had hollowed out his own life, leaving nothing but wealth and regret. The quest for truth was over. A new, far more impossible quest was just beginning, the quest for a redemption he knew with chilling certainty he would never deserve. The Innovate Tomorrow Summit was the global nexus of the technology world, a 3-day spectacle where ideas that would shape the future were unveiled. This year, the most anticipated keynote address was not from a Silicon Valley giant, but from Auratech, the disruptive startup that had revolutionized the field of accessibility. And in the front row of the VIP section, a place usually reserved for the titans of the industry, sat Damien Blackwood. He was not there as a sponsor or an investor. He was there as a penitent on a pilgrimage, and the stage was his shrine. Backstage, in the quiet, focused calm of the green room, Alara stood before a full-length mirror. She didn't see a clear reflection, only her own blurry silhouette, a woman in a simple, elegant, dark gray dress, her posture straight, her shoulders back. Maya stood beside her, adjusting the tiny, discreet earpiece. Alara wore a prototype of Auratech's next-generation spatial awareness device. Nervous Maya asked, her voice a low, comforting rumble. "No," Alara replied, and it was the truth. "This isn't a performance. It's just telling our story. Well, there are about 5,000 people out there waiting to hear it." Maya grinned, including, according to the guest list, the big bad wolf himself. Ilara's calm expression didn't flicker. She had known this day would come. In their respective orbits of power, a collision was inevitable. "He's just another man in a suit, Maya. He has no power over me anymore." When the announcer called her name, a wave of applause washed over the auditorium. Alara walked onto the stage with a fluid, confident grace that silenced the few whispers of surprise from those who didn't know she was blind. She didn't use a cane or a guide. She moved with an unnerving certainty, her path guided by the subtle clicks and vibrations from the device in her ear, a living demonstration of the technology she was about to present. Damien watched her from the front row, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. The 3 years had transformed her. The fragile, hesitant girl was gone, replaced by this commanding, luminous woman. She was more beautiful than he remembered, but it was not her physical beauty that struck him dumb. It was the aura of unshakable self-possession that surrounded her. This was the woman he had thrown away. Alara stepped up to the podium, and a respectful silence fell over the vast hall. We are taught to see our limitations as weaknesses. She began, her voice clear and steady, resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. We are told they are obstacles to be overcome, deficits to be managed. For most of my life, I believed that. My blindness was a cage. But I learned that a cage can also be a crucible. I learned to see my limitation, not as a weakness, but as a data set. She went on to speak with a passion and eloquence that held the entire audience captive. She didn't talk about complex algorithms or lines of code. She talked about the human experience, about translating the visual world into a language the other senses could understand. She spoke of turning a personal challenge into a universal solution. It was more than a product pitch. It was a manifesto of resilience and innovation. Damien sat through the entire speech, mesmerized, each word a fresh indictment of his own blindness. He had been given a rare and precious gift, a person of immense courage, integrity, and brilliance, and he had been too arrogant, too cynical to recognize it. He had looked at a diamond and seen only glass. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in a thunderous standing ovation that went on for several minutes. He remained seated, a statue in a sea of applause, the sound of it a roar in his ears, condemning him. The moment she left the stage, he was on his feet and moving. Backstage was a chaotic swirl of executives, journalists, and well-wishers, all clamoring for a moment with Alara. Maya, fierce and protective, stood guard at the door to the green room, fending them off with the skill of a seasoned bouncer. Damien approached the cordon, his presence alone causing a ripple in the crowd. People recognized him, their expressions shifting to curiosity and surprise. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and directed at Maya. Maya turned, and her friendly gatekeeper smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. "You!" she snarled. "You have a universe of nerve showing your face here. I need to speak with her," Damien said, his eyes pleading, stripped of their usual authority. "She has nothing to say to you." Maya shot back, blocking the doorway with her body. "You had your chance to talk 3 years ago. You made your speech quite publicly, as I recall. Now get out of here before I call security." "Please," Damien said, and the word was raw, torn from a place of deep desperation. "It's not about what I want. It's about what I owe her. There are things she needs to know. The truth." The word hung in the air between them. Ilara's voice came from inside the room, calm and controlled. "It's all right, Maya. Let him in." Maya stared at Alara, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. But she finally stepped aside, her eyes promising Damien a painful death if he hurt her friend again. Damien stepped into the sterile quiet of the green room. Alara was standing by a large window that overlooked the city, her back to him. The door clicked shut, sealing them in a capsule of pressurized silence. He didn't know where to begin. Every rehearsed speech, every prepared apology evaporated in the face of her quiet, unyielding stillness. He was left with nothing but the ugly, unvarnished truth. "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "What I did to you, it was unforgivable. There is no excuse, but there is a reason. I was deceived, and you deserve to know by whom." She still didn't turn around. He took that as permission to continue. He walked to the small table in the center of the room and placed a thick, leather-bound folder upon it. "Everything is in here," he said, his voice strained. "The full report from my investigators, the unedited video footage from the alley, the financial records showing my Uncle Julian was the one who paid your stepfather, the sworn confession from the maid Sophie detailing how Vanessa paid her to lure you into my study. It was all of them, from the very beginning. The accident was a setup. The ball, it was a planned execution. They used me as their weapon." He poured out the entire story, the whole sordid tale of betrayal and greed, his voice low and heavy with self-loathing. He laid the conspiracy bare, not to absolve himself, but to finally give her the vindication she had been so brutally denied. "I didn't come here today to ask for your forgiveness," he finished, his voice cracking slightly, "because I know I don't deserve it. I will never deserve it. I came to give you the truth. It's the only thing I have left that I can offer you." He stood in the ringing silence, his confession hanging in the air. He had exposed his family's darkest secrets, his own monumental failure. He had made himself utterly vulnerable. Finally, Alara turned from the window. Her face was a cool, serene mask. The heartbroken girl he had exiled was gone, and in her place was a queen surveying him from an unreachable throne. There were no tears in her eyes, only a calm, dispassionate clarity. She walked to the table but didn't look at the folder. She looked directly at him. "Thank you for the information, Mr. Blackwood," she said, and the formal address was a blade that slid between his ribs. "It confirms the details of what I have always known in my heart. The evidence may be useful for my legal team." Her composure was absolute, her voice as smooth and cool as marble. "You didn't just believe a lie," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "You chose to believe it. It was easier for you to see me as a villain than to question your own judgment, to question the word of a man like your uncle. You built me a cage out of a sense of duty, and when I became an inconvenience, you threw me to the wolves to preserve your own pride. An apology doesn't rebuild a world, Damien. It doesn't erase 3 years of fighting just to feel safe again. It doesn't quiet the memory of 1,000 whispers and stares." She picked up her bag from a chair, her movements calm and deliberate. "We have nothing more to discuss." She said the words, a final clean severance. "Our business, all of it, is concluded." She turned and walked to the door where Maya was waiting. She didn't look back. The door opened and closed, and she was gone, leaving Damien alone in the stark white room. He stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. The file, his grand offering of truth, sat on the table between them, untouched. He had come here hoping that the truth might build a bridge, however fragile, across the canyon of his betrayal. But he saw now with devastating clarity that it hadn't. It had only served to illuminate just how vast and uncrossable that canyon truly was. He had taken his first step on the long road to atonement, only to be shown that it was a road that led nowhere, and that he was destined to walk it alone. The file Damien had left on the table in the green room was a declaration of war. Not Alara's war, for she had no desire for revenge, but a war for the truth. Armed with the irrefutable evidence, Oratek's formidable legal team, led by a lawyer who moved with the quiet lethality of a panther, took the information and ran with it. This was no longer a personal grievance. It was a matter of corporate espionage and criminal conspiracy that had indirectly targeted Alara, their CEO. The downfall of Julian Blackwood and Vanessa Langdon was not a slow decline. It was a spectacular, breathtaking implosion. The story erupted across the news, a sordid tale of greed and betrayal amongst the city's elite. News headlines screamed the sordid details. Blackwood heir arrested in conspiracy plot. Socialite Vanessa Langdon implicated in attempted murder scandal. Julian's carefully constructed world of charm and influence crumbled to dust. His financial ruin was laid bare, his respectable reputation shredded. He was arrested in his private club, the image of him being led away in handcuffs, a shocking juxtaposition to the opulent surroundings. He faced a litany of charges, from conspiracy and fraud to his involvement in the hit-and-run that had nearly killed his own sister-in-law. Vanessa, abandoned by her powerful family, who moved swiftly to cut all ties, was disgraced. The pretty, venomous socialite was exposed as a desperate accomplice, her future now a bleak landscape of courtrooms and public shame. Alara watched the news reports from the quiet of her apartment, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. It was simply the final ugly chapter of a book she was desperate to close. The external threats were gone, the villains unmasked. But the real conflict, the one that raged within the silent chambers of her own heart, remained unresolved. It was Damien who took the final, most unexpected step. A week after Julian's arrest, he called a press conference. The media, still in a frenzy over the scandal, packed the largest ballroom at the city's most exclusive hotel. They expected a carefully worded statement from a team of lawyers, a standard exercise in corporate damage control. They got something else entirely. Damien walked onto the stage alone. There were no lawyers, no public relations team flanking him. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been, but he stood tall, his gaze steady as he faced the blinding wall of camera flashes. "Thank you for coming." He began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphones. "I have not called you here today to discuss the future of Blackwood Corporation, nor to comment on the ongoing legal proceedings involving my uncle. I have called you here to make a public confession and a long overdue apology." A stunned silence fell over the room. 3 years ago at the Blackwood Foundation charity ball, I publicly and wrongfully accused a woman named Alara Vance of a crime she did not commit. He said, his voice unwavering. I did not just make a mistake. I participated in a cruel and calculated character assassination, and in doing so, I publicly humiliated an innocent woman. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sea of reporters. The evidence of her innocence is now a matter of public record. But I want to be clear about my own role in that injustice. I was presented with a lie that was crafted to prey on my own worst instincts, my pride, my suspicion, and my arrogance. And I chose to believe it. The greatest failing in this entire affair was not my uncle's greed, but my own profound failure of judgment. I had a duty to protect Ms. Vance, and I failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He looked directly into the main television camera as if speaking to an audience of one. To Alara Vance, I am profoundly and unreservedly sorry. My actions caused you irreparable harm, and for that I will live with a lifetime of regret. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I ask only for this truth to be known. I was wrong. She was and is a woman of greater integrity and courage than anyone I have ever known. He then turned and walked off the stage, leaving a room of seasoned, cynical journalists in a state of dumbfounded silence. In a world of carefully managed images and legal deflections, they had just witnessed an act of complete and total self-immolation. Damian Blackwood, the untouchable titan, had sacrificed his own pride on the public altar to restore the honor of the woman he had wronged. Alara watched the press conference on a large screen in her office, Maya standing silently beside her. When it was over, Maya let out a long, low whistle. Well, she said, I'll be damned. The monster has a conscience after all. Alara said nothing. She was shaken. The act was so contrary to the man she thought she knew. It was not a calculated move for public sympathy. It was a genuine act of penance, and it was the first thing he had done that managed to find a hairline crack in the formidable wall she had built around her heart. He found her 3 nights later. He didn't come to the gleaming high-rise headquarters of Oratech. He didn't send a car or an assistant. He came to Maya's bookstore, the Crooked Spine, the place where her new life had begun. It was late, and the store was quiet. Alara was curled in a worn, comfortable armchair in her favorite corner, a pair of high-tech headphones over her ears, listening to a new novel. Maya was closing up the register. The bell over the door chimed softly. Maya looked up, her friendly smile freezing on her face. Damien stood in the doorway, looking entirely out of place in the cozy, chaotic shop. He was not wearing a suit, but a simple dark sweater and trousers. He looked like a man, not an empire. He looked at Maya, his expression respectful. May I have a word with her, please? Maya glanced at Alara, who had taken off her headphones, her face unreadable. Alara gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. With a final protective glare at Damien, Maya retreated into the back apartment. Damien walked slowly toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. He didn't try to sit or crowd her space. That was a brave thing you did, Alara said, her voice quiet. The press conference. It wasn't bravery, he replied, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was just the truth. The very least I owed you. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the store's coolers and the distant sigh of traffic. I know I can't erase what I did. He began, his gaze fixed on the floor. I know I don't deserve a second chance. The man who did that to you? He was blind. He could see the world, but he had no vision. He couldn't see the truth when it was standing right in front of him. He couldn't see courage or honor or goodness. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. You taught me the difference between sight and vision, Alara, he said softly. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to learn how to truly see, to be worthy of the lesson you taught me. Alara listened, her heart a tumultuous sea of warring emotions. The rage had cooled, leaving behind the deep scarred tissue of her pain. To hold on to that pain forever, to let it define the rest of her life, felt like its own kind of prison. Forgiving him wasn't about absolving him. It was about liberating herself. It was the final bar on her own cage, and only she held the key. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, Damien, she said, her voice honest, devoid of artifice. I don't expect you to, he said quickly. I will never ask you to. She looked at him, at this changed, broken, and remorseful man. She saw the end of a long, painful chapter and the terrifying, uncertain blank page of a new one. The bakery next door, she said, a faint, tentative smile touching her lips for the first time. They make the best coffee in the city. Would you like to get a cup with me? It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of a future. But it was a beginning. A chance to start a new story, one built not on a contract or a debt, but on a foundation of brutal honesty and the shared human hope for redemption. Damien's eyes filled with a light she had never seen before, a light of profound, unutterable gratitude. "Yes, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I would like that very much." Epilogue. 1 year later, the sun streamed through the large windows of the newly opened Eleanor Blackwood Children's Hospital. In the pediatric wing's state-of-the-art sensory room, Damien watched as a young boy blind from birth reached out and touched a textured wall. The wall hummed with a soft vibration, and a gentle synthesized voice from a nearby speaker said, "Blue. This feels like the sky." The technology was a joint project, a partnership between the Blackwood Foundation and Oratech. Alara came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. Their fingers interlaced naturally, a gesture of easy, familiar intimacy. "He's mapping the world," she said softly, a proud smile on her face. "You gave him a world to map." Damien replied, turning to look at her. He still saw her through a slight blur, but his vision had never been clearer. He saw her strength, her compassion, her brilliance. He saw his partner, his equal, his home. True sight, they had both learned, was not about what the eyes could see, but what the heart could understand. And true strength wasn't about never falling. It was about having the courage to help someone up, especially when you were the one who had pushed them down. Their story wasn't a fairy tale of a princess and a prince, but something far more real and far more precious, a story of two imperfect people who had navigated the darkness and found a way to build their own light together. Thank you for joining us on this journey with Alara and Damien. Their story is a powerful reminder that compassion and truth can heal even the deepest wounds. If you were moved by their story, we would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing meaningful stories to you. We'll see you next time.